And good afternoon. Welcome back to our Festival of Social Science event today with the University of Sheffield and the ESRC. My name is Michelle Patel. I am the Head of Social Science in the Food Standards Agency, and I just wanted to say thank you to Vanna Aldin for chairing this morning so expertly. This afternoon session, we are going to carry on looking at some fascinating presentations about understanding food in the digital world. We've got two sessions this afternoon. We have a first session looking at the potential of social media listening to contribute to what we understand about food and how people experience it. And then after a panel discussion of that, we're going to have a short presentation from Professor Peter Jackson of the University of Sheffield, who has been advising on the national food strategy and the public engagement, which I'm sure is going to be extremely interesting for everyone. And after we've had a chance to ask Peter some questions, we're going to have some closing remarks from Professor Rick Mumford, who is Head of Science at the Food Standards Agency. As this morning, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I will then read them out, so if you could put who you are and who you're affiliated with, I'll be able to attribute question to person, and let's go on. So with no further ado, please could I hand over to Anna Rudkiewicz from Pulsar, who has been looking at how we use social media data to surface food trends and understand the audiences.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Michelle. Thank you for tuning into this session. So I'm excited to share my presentation with you now. Right, so I trust everyone is able to see this. So I'm Anna Rudkiewicz. I'm a Senior Research Manager at Pulsar.
Anna, your desktop isn't.
Oh. It's showing as.
There we are.
Okay, apologies for this. Yeah, it was showing as though my screen was being shared, but it was not. Okay, everything's fine now. Great, so I'm going to be talking about a project that we ran in partnership with Food Standards Agency, and it was designed to use social data to surface food trends and understand audiences. So Pulsar, we're the data-driven audience insights practice, so we use mostly social data, but the reason why we like to think of ourselves as more of an audience insights practice is because we also deploy the latest qualitative and quantitative research methods to AI and combine it with the expertise of the researchers in the team to arrive not just at analytics but at actionable insights. And this was very much the aim with this study. So FSA engaged Pulsar to conduct a broad food trends landscape study looking at the last year and what movements we've seen in terms of the food conversation on social media. So in order to do this, we used Twitter data for our volumetric analysis, which from previous work we know Twitter is very much where trends surface and bubble up. And then for what we called our trend deep dives, we also combined it with data from forum and reviews. And we use some of the interesting emergent techniques in the area as well for this study. So we not only looked at social media mentions of food, for example, but we also used the image recognition AI specifically designed to trained to recognize food images for this. We also used our proprietary trained virality framework, so not just looking at the growth rate of particular trends over time, but also at a couple of other metrics such as volatility and velocity designed to build that bigger picture of actually how the shape of those trends is changing. And finally, we also use audience segmentation, applying it to specific conversations of interest to understand the communities behind some of these conversations as well. So it was a large-scale study. It was over probably 90 pages long, so I'm not going to be able to go into detail about all of the insights that we uncovered, but what I will aim to do is use some of the examples from the study to illustrate the methodological underpinning of it. So where we started is from a broad data set collecting social mentions of using keywords like cooking, eating, ingredients for the last 3 months. We then used a number of techniques such as keyword filtering, image analysis, looking at top image tags, top content to understand and surface what might be considered as trends. The next step constituted volumetric analysis, where we looked at the differences between volumes of discussion for these specific topics in the last year versus the year before. Then, in collaboration with Food Standards Agency, we agreed on around 30 trends to conduct a deep dive in, which meant we looked at specific drivers behind these conversations and what propelled them. And finally, we've conducted audience mapping of 2 broad audiences, one being allergies and hypersensitivities audience, and another one people broadly discussing food standards post-Brexit. And there was a lot of data unstructured data that we were aiming to organize. So we created 7 categories, which included food systems, ingredients and process, health, intolerances, diets, habits and routines, food safety and sustainability, that we grouped our trends into. We also assigned the taxonomy to those categories. So we looked at higher level trends versus smaller specific trends. And finally, we also classified them into themes. So COVID-19 driven versus everyday life versus public concern trends as well. And finally, we grouped some of these trends together to form what we refer to as macro trends, which allowed us to look at scale, at growth rate, annual growth rate for the specific trends group. So this is an example from ingredients and processes category, where we see these macro trends in action. So for instance, we can see cooking methods as an overall macro trend being on the rise, so it's in the green bubble, versus wellness trends that we see declining compared to the previous year. And this table goes into more detail in terms of which specific trends have gone to form that macro trend. So for instance, slow cooking, stir fry, air frying, all form the part of a cooking methods trend, which we can hypothesize people having more time and more willingness in the last year to explore different cooking techniques that they might have not done before. Whereas what we refer to as wellness focus, so trends such as matcha, coconut oils, kombucha, superfoods, the kind of things that you might see popularized on Instagram, have been declining in the last year. And then we selected specific trends to which we've applied this virality model that I've mentioned before, looking at metrics such as velocity, which is a measure of how quickly the conversation saturates, for example, volatility, which aims to understand how much fluctuation there is in the volume of discussion over time. Maybe there are very big peaks and also big drops in discussion, so it's not consistent. And then we looked at lifespan as well, so it's the number of days at which during which the trend discussion sustains at a similar level. So there's a lot we can say about these metrics, but we've created some visualizations to kind of give a bit of a qualitative meaning to a sum of these different ways of looking at the data. And as you can see, we have a lot of trends that are in this heating up, so the conversation is growing, but it's also streaky, meaning that it has a high level of volatility, whereas conversations that are more steady, such as discussion about being plant-based and conscious consuming and green diets, they're steady, but they're also declining. So just this quick example illustrates how much of an impact ongoing conversations on social media about COVID-19 and Brexit have had on the whole food landscape discussion on social media in the last year, and how much of an influence it had. So just very quickly, would love to go through the audience analysis side of things as well. So we looked at trends within the allergy and hypersensitivity areas. So as you can see, all of them have been declining in the last year, and we broke them down into specific allergies as well that people are discussing. And this is just an example of one of the deep dives that we've conducted, looking at allergies and intolerances. So what drives the conversation on social media, different peaks throughout the year, but also key kind of aspects of the discussion. And we can see that labeling is the biggest driver of conversation within that discussion. But what was the most interesting, I think, for me personally, at least within the audience, with the allergies and hypersensitivities conversation, is the audience aspect of it. So we looked at who's behind this conversation, and it was really comprising of varied and distinct segments. So this is based on people's Twitter affinities, what accounts they follow, and we can see a wide variety of different audiences, and it just illustrates how different communities can be discussing the same subject, but discussing it very, very differently. So what we're able to do using social data is define the audience. In this instance, it was everybody talking about allergies and hypersensitivities, then segment it, and then classify the conversation again, revealing specific attitudes, language, topics, and behaviors of those specific audience groups we zeroed in on. So in this instance, just to wrap up with a quick example of this, we have the audience of mommy bloggers and nutritionists, which was comprising 7% of the overall conversation. And the way they talk about allergies and hypersensitivities is very much geared towards sharing recipes and seeking advice on catering towards family members with dietary special requirements, whereas the group of vegans and animal lovers that was comprising 4% of this conversation was focused a lot more on using the risk of allergy to dairy to discourage people from consuming dairy products. So same conversation, very different outcomes depending on who's talking. Very quick whistle-stop tour, our research, but this is it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and as you say, far too much in there to be able to give any justice to in 10 minutes. I've seen the whole deck, and there's a depth of work in there that it's really impossible to cover. But we will be publishing it, and we will be using it, and it looks at across lots of different topics, not just the allergic community, and it's a really great piece of work. So thank you guys for that. Staying on the subject of social media listening, I'm going to hand over to our own Beatrix Siemering from the data science team, who led on the social media listening that we did around COVID-19. Beatrix, over to you.
Hi everybody, and thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Anna, for the really good presentation on that. It was really interesting to see. And you also mentioned that COVID was one of the big topics you noticed. So I'm gonna carry on with that and talk about social media listening. That I hope you can see my presentation now. Might be a second. Oh, fantastic. Yes. So I'll be talking about the social media listening that was done for the FSA COVID-19 Horizon Scanning group that Michelle just mentioned. And this work was done or the social media listening was done between the 1st of March and the 1st of August this year. So the first question I would like to go into is why would we listen to social media? What can we get from social media? And I just wanted to show you a very short selection of tweets and the dates they were tweeted, to give you a bit of an idea of the data we actually get and what we're actually looking at. And the very strong, the very incredibly unique benefit we get from social media is that we get a real-time response from people to things that are happening. So COVID has developed very, very rapidly, and lockdown has happened very rapidly and changed very rapidly over time. And looking at social media gives us a unique opportunity to see how people respond to that and what concerns and worries they might bring up on social media. It's quite interesting looking at very late February, when there was very, very few known cases, less than 5 known cases of COVID in the UK. The conversations people had around COVID and food were completely different to during and after lockdown. But when we look at social media, one of the things we need to be very, very much aware of is that social media and Twitter is not a representation of the real world. It's a unique data source. It's a specific demographic. And that's not directly proportional to the demographic of the UK. So it's extremely powerful and extremely insightful and gives us something that we could not get any other way. But we do have to look at it with quite a bit of caution. So now I will very quickly talk about what we are doing when we're listening to social media. So Anna has talked about Pulsar, which is the platform we also used for that, and we specifically specifically looked for social media posts that mentioned food. So obviously that's what we're interested in, and then also COVID. And that was in itself a really, really interesting question. And what do you listen for when you're interested in COVID? Because the language that people use to talk about COVID-19, coronavirus, quarantine, lockdown has really, really changed over time. And it's actually really, really fascinating to see in real time how our language has changed quite drastically. If we're thinking about words like self-isolation, social distancing and lockdown, that's something we all use on a regular basis nowadays. They're completely new in the way we use them than last year. So really, really interesting to see that. So yeah, basically we looked at social media that contained food and an evolving list of terms relating to COVID-19. And then we try to group that in topics. So there is a full report available on that as well, published on the FSA website. So Michelle mentioned earlier in the day that if you just Google FSA and COVID research, you get all the published reports, and the full report is available on that as well. So this is just an overview of everything we found from the 1st of March to the 1st of August. So restaurants, pubs and cafes were one of the key topics people were talking about. That also included businesses tweeting about changes in their opening times, and it was quite often in response to lockdown and changing lockdown regulations. And the 3 topics I will talk about in a little bit more detail, food insecurity, food delivery and food supply, are all key topics we found on social media, and they're all relating to people's accessibility of food. So how can people access food? So food insecurity was a huge topic, and obviously links in with lockdown and COVID itself having a huge economic impact. So we're talking especially about food banks being mentioned, and free school meals. Delivery was another big topic, with people who were vulnerable and who were shielding, relying on food delivery. And the topic on social media was a lot around the availability of delivery for vulnerable people. And then food supply as well, and that included things like stockpiling, empty supermarket shelves. And that was a very big but very short-lived topic on social media, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So this is 2 graphs, the first one showing trends in food insecurity and the second one in food supply. So we try to break that down in more subtopics. So with food insecurity, we separated out things relating to food bank and food bank use, which has been an ongoing topic. So here, sorry, the date starting 1st of March, and this bar indicates the start of the first lockdown. So there's an ongoing concern around food bank and food bank use, and you have individual spikes in a topic normally relating to events where a company or a private person has made a donation to a food bank and that was then shared on social media. You have free school meals popping up around the beginning of lockdown, and then again in summer when there was a discussion on whether free school meals would be extended over summer. And then on the lower graph, you see things related to food supply. So just to note that the number of posts we're looking at are on a different scale for food supply. So you had this really huge spike in people talking about stockpiling. That would include like hoarding of food, empty supermarket shelves, and people feeling or voicing on social media that they weren't able to get the foods they wanted in the supermarket. So there was a really big spike in that discussion, but it was very, very short-lived and then went down to virtually nothing, which is a big contrast to other topics. Supply chain is a quite interesting one because there were very small individual but very interesting conversations about the supply chain, the food supply chain and COVID and how that has changed. And later over summer that also started to interlink with discussions around Brexit. So people would talk about Brexit, COVID and the food supply chain. So issues relating to COVID were not just about COVID, but then later in the year started to connect with other topics as well. So in terms of what we found on social media, we are looking at very strong discussion around food accessibility. One of the other things we were interested in was unsafe food behavior. So we had very specific questions around if people are using unsafe methods to clean food, if they're maybe using bleach or disinfectant on raw produce. So we looked at the words that people were using when they talked about cleaning food. And here we found that one of the key topics was packaging and people cleaning their packaging, which is good. And when we looked at bleach specifically, we found a strong signal at the time that was relating to comments from President Trump about using bleach and light as a potential COVID cure. So that was quite early in the year. And that wasn't related to food directly, but then because we specifically looked for food and tweets in the UK, there was a weaker signal where people were commenting on bleach and light and then also food in that conversation. So that is what we found in terms of specific questions. And then to just very quickly wrap that up, in terms of why are we looking at social media and what have we gained from looking at social media. So what we have found is we could identify the key themes that people were talking about, and we could get insight into those themes. So when people were talking, for example, about food delivery and what way they were talking about it, and in this case with concerns about vulnerable people. And as I just showed, we could also look at specific questions. So we could look at tweets that were specifically making references to food hygiene and food cleaning procedures. And we could check if there was any indication that people were doing this in an unsafe way that we could then respond to. And we could also look at reaction to specific events. So especially looking at restaurants, pubs and cafes and how people felt about going to those, or how businesses themselves advertise themselves, was very strongly in a response to lockdown and lockdown restrictions. And I'm nearly out of time, so I just want to say thank you very much for listening and thanks for joining us today. And if you have any questions that we don't have time to address later, you're very, very welcome to email me, and then we can have a chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrix. And as you can say, some equally fascinating stuff coming through from very close analysis of keywords during COVID. And at the time, we were reporting that in weekly to the CEO. And finally, on this section around the potential of social media, I would like to introduce Alexandra Butopoulou from the University of Sheffield. But before I hand over to her, I just want to remind people that if you want to ask a question, there's going to be time at the end of this presentation. There's a couple of questions already in the Q&A. Please put your question in, tell us who you are and where you're from, and I will read out the question at the end. So Alexandra, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. I hope you'll hear me clearly. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me. I'm very excited to be talking among you all. I'm going to share my desktop now, so please let me know whether you can see my PowerPoint. Can you see it?
No, not yet. We were sort of halfway there. Can you try again?
Yes. Well, it's already shared. What about now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm going to put my presentation on presentation mode. So you can only see my my presentation now. Is that all right? Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
All right, so let's start then. So I'm Alexandra Boutopoulou. I am working on my PhD at the University of Sheffield. I'm focusing on big data, visual social media and food cultures. My project is funded by the White Rose ESRC network on big data and food safety. And this network is a research collaboration with the Food Studies Agency and Pulsar, an audience intelligence company that we just so the representation, before I continue to the main body of my research, I'm just going to introduce you briefly to it. My research is focusing on the increasingly popular practices of a set of highly active online actors, self-defined as wellness bloggers. You might know some of them. These actors, and mostly female, have very popular blogs and social media profiles, especially on Instagram. They generate an abundance of pictures of their shopping, of their cooking preparations, and of their outcomes, and post them online to communicate with their audiences. And I personally aim to chart the ways in which visual social media have shaped recent social phenomena of healthy eating and plant-based diets, as well as wellness discourses and lifestyle practices in the UK. And I would like also to provide evidence, information and data-based insights that could be further used by the Food Studies Agency to understand and eventually influence consumer behaviors in relation to healthy eating. And to do that, I'm going to be focusing on the analysis of the visual social media content generated by a particular actor, the influential food blogger Deliciously Ella on Instagram. You might know her or not. I'm going to be talking about her briefly a bit later on. The originality of the approach of my project consists in the focus of distinctively visual analysis, which has not been conducted before on this particular topic of plant-based food on social media. And furthermore, due to Instagram's API limitations, and especially compared to the more popular Twitter's API, my approach is more original because still Instagram visual data analysis is quite scarce. My theoretical framework, I'm borrowing ideas from Goffman, self-presentation and authenticity, Bourdieu, distinction and luxury, and a more recent theory by French sociologists Luc Boltanski and Arnaud Esquer on enrichment. I'm combining qualitative and computational methods in order to analyze a very large data set of images. I have collected manually 4,000 Instagram posts from the very first image ever uploaded on Deliciously Ella's Instagram account in January 2013 until the 24th of October 2018, when she partially shut down her brick and mortar business in London. And although someone might wonder why I, collected manually all these images, although it was more laborious and time consuming, manual data collection on Instagram was selected in order to ensure all relevant post and image information at one go, and also to eliminate the cost of an Instagram analytics third-party service. So for today, I'm going to show you a brief selection of insights taken from a pilot study of 100 Instagram posts of Deliciously Ella. And I aim at contributing towards the understanding of a wider social phenomenon of healthy eating and wellness lifestyle practices, as particularly mediated through Instagram. And I'm seeking a very productive panel discussion later through a juxtaposition with previous presentations. We just saw social media listening of the audience. I'm going to be showing you data from social media listening of the person who actually talks to the audience. So for those of you who don't know her or know her just briefly, who is Deliciously Ella? So Ella Woodward-Mills is a plant-based food advocate, an entrepreneur, a businesswoman, a best-selling cookbook writer, and an Instagram influencer. Today, she counts more than 2 million followers on Instagram. And just to give you perspective, latest data from Statista shows that Instagram in the UK has about 27 million users. Ella gained publicity in 2013 after creating the blog Deliciously Ella. And she created the blog because she wanted to share her personal story about fighting and managing postural tachycardia syndrome, something that she suffered of. And she claims that after all medical treatments had allegedly failed her, she decided to practice a self-invented plant-based diet that helped her overcome her illness. She was an advocate of clean eating right from the start of her blogging career, but denounced it in the early days of 2017 after a media backlash that put in question its effects on health and well-being. So throughout the next few slides, I'm going to show you 5 examples selected from a pilot study, as I mentioned before, from the 11th of June to the 4th of August 2017. These Instagram posts reflect a part of Deliciously Ella's online and offline activities during the summer of 2017. They also involve promotions of new products, new menus, but at the same time, presentation of personal moments such as her brother's wedding in Italy. And the questions I asked myself at first looking at these pictures were more or less simple in the beginning. What do these posts show? First of all, what kind of food can we see there? What type of meal is shown? Who is in the picture and where is it all happening? These are the kinds of questions that can provide us a basic overview of the issues. I haven't engaged in more detailed analysis in the presentation in this instance because it would have taken us too far from the topic. Although there are very interesting questions in these projects, and they could be asked, for example, questions about luxury items that might be found in the visuals, or luxury clothes that she selects to wear, or even the visual composition of the pictures, or the spaces and the places that the picture is taken. But that's probably for another presentation. So, question number 1, what do the posts show? Of course, they show food, but they show food only by 53%. So the rest, 47%, is about people, is about food and people, and various other categories like nature or animals. What kind of food is depicted? Well, these are here the top 10 foods appeared in the analysis. Definitely, we often see Ella's own products because she has a product line at the supermarkets. Ella's original granola, Ella's energy balls, and Ella's bitter muesli. Other than that, we can see loads of fruits and vegetables, avocados, carrots, raspberries, chia puddings, etc., and some more specialized ingredients and products. You might wonder that some of these foods are not very complicated. Partially that's because it's still early in her Instagram life. Her recipes and food presentations have been more complex and more complicated as time went by. What kind of meal is shown? So we see loads of breakfasts, loads of lunches and snacks, desserts, smoothies and salads. And what's interesting here is that the setting and the way that all these foods are photographed are very Instagrammable, as the Instagram jargon would say, meaning that you will see breakfast bowls from a bird's eye view, or this top-down kind of photography, or very colorful smoothies that are perfect for an Instagram, a popular Instagram post. Who is in the picture? So Ella, of course, and Matt, usually. Matt is her husband and partner in business as well. Ella, Matt, and Austin as well, their dog. And lately, after she had 2 baby girls, she photographs the girls and posts pictures on Instagram as well. And finally, where is all this happening? So mainly it happens in London, where she keeps her business as well. And also during the time of the pilot study in Italy, where her brother got married. So one might wonder, okay, so what's in it for me here? What is this all about? It's certainly not only about food. I mean, it is about food, but there is more behind it. It's also about the projection of a certain kind of appearance, which includes personal life details. And it's not just marketing products or the promotion of plant-based food here, but basically it's a staging of personal experiences and real life moments in ways such as to make the actor appear authentic or real to the intended audience. Also, a comparison with social distributions of food tastes among classes seems to possibly explain why there is focus on certain foods. There is vast literature about that, why particular classes select certain foods. Here we see loads of avocado, chia seed, granola. Later we'll see turmeric and more, even more rare spices and ingredients in her recipes. And finally, mingling food with people and objects can be based on the idea of valuing and marketing artisanal forms of food production. So food here is not just a product, but maybe the nexus, authenticity, and cosmopolitan person food. I'm trying to create new words here, but there is a sense in which the person markets herself and her family along with her food to create extra economic value. What she sells is not just a product. It's a whole narrative that accompanies the product and transforms it into an object desired by others. And partially, maybe that answers the question that many of her followers have online, that her products are quite expensive compared to the supermarket products, that the mainstream supermarket products that one might find offline. So that's all from me now. Thank you so much for listening. And going back to Michelle.
Thank you very much, Alex. You're still sharing your screen, I believe. And again, you know, fascinating run through how social media can be used to establish a brand narrative, and a really interesting angle on that. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. First one came through about the Pulsar piece of work. Anna, this is one for you. So it was around how did you choose your sample, and particularly referring to the ones with allergies and intolerances. How big was the sample size of tweets that you had there? You have that?
Yeah, so I noticed the question, so I had a moment to go back and double check. So it was around 40,000 people, or shall I say Twitter users. It's all based on Twitter data, which kind of segues into the second question. So Twitter is the channel that has the most publicly available data points that you can gather. It's the most public API due to the public nature of Twitter itself as a channel. So because of that, we're able to ingest Twitter data through Pulsar platform using keywords. So in this instance, we started with the food data sets and then zeroed in on specific keywords related to allergies and intolerances, and then some of the ways in which people might discuss it. So for instance, can't have or have a reaction to paired with terms signifying food. And then for the audience part of the study, then it runs through the audience segmentation, which is based on how these accounts present within the allergy conversation interact with other accounts on Twitter, to be able to build up the picture of different communities that make up the allergies and intolerances audience. I hope that helps answer the question in a nutshell.
Thank you. Another question, I think, for you, which is I was asking when we were going to publish the Pulsar piece, which I think we're going to try and do that after Christmas, all things being well. A question now for Alexandra. How long did it take you to save 4,000 posts?
Well, I did my data collection about 2.5 years ago, because I was, well, after that, I had a pause for a maternity leave. And I saw also some questions here, or some, well, notes here saying that there are apps that do that in 10 seconds. Well, 2.5 years ago, apps or some codes that I tried to write in order to collect all these images could not save all the relevant information and needed in the images as well. So that's why I did it manually. It took me about 2 months working on the collection of the images, solidly 2 months working on the collection of the images and archiving the images as well, and saving the files as well, in order to be able to have my whole data set ready to start analyzing.
And one final question, again for you, Alexandra. Do you have an idea about who follows Deliciously Ella? Are they British people or are they more international people?
I have not, well, my project does not involve her followers at all. So I'm only following what she's doing online. However, from my experience watching and following her as well, just to be able to understand this experience, this online experience of Deliciously Ella, I mostly see UK users. However, I'm just being very cautious saying that. It's my own personal experience and not like proper analysis. I know that she's quite popular in other countries apart from the UK, the United States and Germany. She has published books there, but it seems that her main audience is a UK audience, as it could be logical. But that's probably an idea for a future work.
And finally, Beatrix, I think you've already answered this question, but to make sure that people have seen it. So how do we obtain the Twitter data, and how do we make sure that we've only got people from the UK? You've said we use the Pulsar platform to access social media data, and we only looked at posts that were from the UK, which is information that you can select for. So we're pretty confident that we were only looking at posts from the UK. I have one final question, I'm afraid, for Alex. Can you talk a little bit more about why you picked Twitter data rather than some of the other sources, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, some of the other areas that are available? Was it to do with access, or is there another reason?
Why did I?
Sorry, I'm sorry. It's a question for Anna.
Oh, sorry.
Hi. Yeah. So we use Pulsar is able to pull data from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, forums, blogs, and reviews, with all of these channels allowing different level of access depending on their APIs. But for specifically trends work, which is what this brief was all about, Twitter data is what we would call upstream. So this is where we know from previous work where trends tend to surface, whereas on forums, you would tend to see kind of business as usual conversation that's just kind of bubbling down in the background, versus Twitter, where we see changes in volumes, which will we are confident will correspond to fluctuations in public opinion, essentially, or cultural shifts.
Thank you very much. So yeah, fascinating area, and one where I think we'll be doing a lot more work in the future. And now that brings us to, I guess, our keynote. So Professor Peter Jackson is with us today. He is the co-director of the University of Sheffield's Institute for Sustainable Food, and he has kindly agreed to talk us through the National Food Strategy Public Engagement, which he is advising on. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And before we start showing the slides, I just wanted to say thank you to Becky for setting up today's event, and particularly to Kabir and Tim, who overcame various technological challenges to enable me to engage today. So thank you to you all, and thank you to Michelle for chairing. Okay, if we can share the slides, please. I think Becky is going to be driving these for me, so thank you very much. I'm talking about the National Food Strategy, and particularly the role of the public dialogues within the National Food Strategy and some of the opportunities and challenges presented through digital engagement. So next slide, please. Very quickly, in case you're not fully briefed on the National Food Strategy, it's led by Henry Dimbleby on behalf of DEFRA. My involvement in it has been to chair the oversight group responsible for delivering the public dialogue part of the National Food Strategy, but I should emphasise I'm speaking today in a personal capacity, not on behalf of the National Food Strategy. The session, I think, is relevant to our theme of understanding food in a digital world, because the COVID-19 pandemic has meant that the dialogues were forced to move from face-to-face in phase 1 to online delivery in phase 2. Next slide, please. So the strategy will be published in 2 parts. The first has already been published, and there's a picture of its cover on the bottom right of my image. The first part focuses on the needs of what Henry Dimbleby called our most disadvantaged children, and particularly recommended an extension of free school meals. And the second theme was what he called sovereignty, standards and scrutiny in the context of the post-Brexit trade deals, which may be coming forward. The second part will focus on the wider food. The second part will focus on the wider food system, what Henry Dimbleby refers to as the economics and power dynamics that shape the system, and the benefits and harms it brings in terms of health, climate change, biodiversity, pollution, AMR, zoonotic diseases, and sustainable resource use. So more environmental focus than the first part. Next, please. So on to the public dialogues, what they tried to achieve. They were delivered by Hopkins Van Mill with input from ScienceWise, who are there on behalf of the UKRI, the UK Research Institutes, to ensure, if you like, the robustness of the methodology, the data collection and interpretation. Hopkins Van Mill's preliminary work included the collection of a series of what we might call vox pop videos, designed to bring a diversity of voices into the conversation, and then a series of interviews with a wide range of experts. The first phase of the public dialogues were conducted face-to-face with diverse groups of people, around 40 in each group, in 5 places: Grimsby, Kendal, Bristol, Norwich and Lewisham, not just the towns themselves, but surrounding areas as well. And they were carefully structured conversations for a full day with a series of events designed to maximise participation. And in the slide here, you see myself, Christian Reynolds and Bhavani Shankar, 3 colleagues then at the University of Sheffield, where Christian's now moved on to City University. This was in the face-to-face exchanges in Grimsby. And if we can get Christian back online or in the chat later on, he was in, I think, the unique position of having participated both face-to-face in the first phase and online in the second phase. So next slide, please. Very briefly, the first phase findings reinforced the message we all know about the importance of cost, both the affordability of food and people's access to it. A lot of discussion about the links between diet and health. Discussion about questions of choice, which in this context, consumer choice, which in this context largely meant access to a variety of foods. And then more challenging issues, I think, in phase 1 were how the public did or didn't understand the complexity of the food system and the wide range of actors and institutions that shape what we buy and eat. And the challenge there, I'll come back to in a few minutes, was to think about how much you could prime the participants in terms of expert presentations on the food system without, if you like, corrupting the data by oversteering or over prompting them. And then the last part of this slide is we also face challenges in terms of how we got the public to recognise and deal with trade-offs between different objectives. So people could think about making an intervention that might address one issue, but were less skilled at thinking about trade-offs between competing objectives. Next slide, please. So between phase 1 and phase 2, the public dialogues were forced to move online. So phase 2 involved the same participants in the same 5 places, but this time delivered entirely online. And Hopkins Van Mill worked hard to maintain the engagement of those from phase 1 in phase 2. They asked people to keep a food journal, they shared their thoughts online, and they did a good job of maintaining contact with them, such that only 1 or 2 people dropped out between phases 1 and 2. There was, if you like, high investment in the process. The engagement at phase 2 aimed to ensure that, and I quote, the quality of the dialogue remains as high on Zoom as it would in person. And there were a range of practical things done using small breakout groups for each facilitator to try and encourage engagement, and allowing more time to think and reflect online than would have been allowed face to face. So these kind of practical challenges, I think, were very well dealt with. They also made sure that everyone participating had access to a laptop, a tablet, or a mobile phone. But as I'm going to say now, online engagement is more than access to technology and more than simple practical challenges. So if we have the next slide, please. This is the key one of the kind of heart of my talk, and it has the least accessible terminology, so apologies for this. I use this terrible word epistemology, thinking about different epistemologies of engagement. What do I mean by that? I mean that we get different kinds of evidence from using different methodologies. The nature of the evidence itself is different depending on the method we use to engage. And my argument is that it might be no less valid than face-to-face, than data collected face-to-face, but it's actually quite hard to make direct comparisons between findings from the 2 phases because the methodology of collection, the methodology of engagement was so different. And I think rather than simply kind of wishing the differences away and thinking about direct comparisons, we need to acknowledge and address these epistemological differences in the nature of the evidence collected. And if you just think for a moment, those of us who are academics have confronted this in terms of our approach to students and the shift to so-called blended learning, blending face-to-face with online delivery. There are interesting questions, challenges about what we might call voice, who gets to speak, who is heard, who has a voice, whose voice is marginalised, about confidence or the lack of it, about the positionality of different speakers in terms of their gender identity or class identity and so on. In face-to-face interaction, we use a lot of visual cues that might be less apparent to us when we're online. There are kind of procedures and protocols for turn-taking, as sociolinguistic scholars talk about. And we also have more access to body language and eye contact, for example, than is possible once we move online. So those things, I think, represent significant challenges for this kind of engagement when, through no fault of our own, we've had to change the methodology halfway through. Next slide, please. I have a couple of slides now on the sort of challenges and opportunities that are involved in this process. The first one is, I think, the most obvious, and that's that there is a danger that we exclude certain social groups who are unfamiliar with digital technology, people who may be unwilling to engage on this basis or not confident in the use of the technology. We compare that, though, with the notion that perhaps some groups are more empowered through using online technology, and we've seen that certainly from our students. Those who are reluctant to speak out in class might be much more amenable to posting a question in the chat. And so in some ways, this is, if you like, more democratic or more inclusive than through other methods, such as face-to-face settings. The group dynamic was also quite different from phase 1 to phase 2. In phase 1, for example, there was a lot of discussion of cooking on a budget and the alleged decline of cooking skills, what social scientists often refer to as a deficit model. People were critical of those who were unable to cook in the way that they thought their parents, particularly their mothers, might cook. There was a sort of public consensus about this that may or may not have been based on fact. There was very limited discussion at phase 1 of the climate crisis. People could talk about the links between food and health, but much less so between food and environment, until they were prompted. And then, of course, there's the impact of the prompt on the conversation. And similarly, links between food and environment were not much in evidence at phase 1, except in this very specific context of food waste, particularly domestic food waste. Next slide, please. So one of the things I'm talking about then is a shift from phase 1 and phase 2 of the public engagement, from face-to-face to online. But as well as that methodological shift, of course, there was also a shift in the context. So it's not just a shift in methods, it's also a shift in how we relate to food in the context of a pandemic. This, of course, led to changes in people's dietary attitudes and behaviours of the kind that FSA has been trying to track through its tracker device and through which other social media methods have been employed. So as we've heard already today, COVID-19 certainly has highlighted the vulnerability of people, the vulnerability of the food system. When we're reliant on just-in-time delivery, for example, that's likely to lead to temporary shortages and to so-called panic buying. Certainly, the pandemic has led to an increase in people experiencing various kinds of food poverty, including the use of food banks and other forms of charitable aid. And there have been massive changes in the hospitality sector with the closure or restrictions on bars and restaurants. And there's been more use of online delivery and so on. A lot of changes in the context, not just in the methods used to engage with the public. And as I think we've been discussing already, there have been some quite paradoxical trends where consumers might be making more use of convenience food, but the same or other consumers might also be doing more home baking and cooking from scratch. My line on this is we need firm evidence of these trends, of the kind that the FSA is trying to collect on our behalf, and we should avoid the kind of moralisation that often attaches to issues about declines in, let's say, cooking skills or wasteful behaviour or not following food safety and so on. These issues are highly susceptible to moralisation, and I think as social scientists we should do our best to avoid that. Next slide, please. Okay, so my last couple of substantive slides are about what I call ongoing issues. And these were issues that we faced as an oversight group trying to advise on the phase 2 dialogues. The first was Henry Dimbleby and the strategy team were very keen to focus on specific issues such as meat reduction. And there was a long debate about whether that was the right focus or whether we'd be better off focusing on the environmental and health impacts of different dietary choices. So a narrow focus on one thing that would kind of force the debate about the environment, or a broader discussion about dietary choices and their range of consequences. The second I've already mentioned in a couple of places, and that's how much to prompt the public in their dialogue, to give them sufficient information to enable participants to engage effectively, but not to steer the conversation too far. That was certainly the case over how far we wanted people to understand the food system, which was a concept which was alien to most of those in the room, even though there was a strong academic consensus about the value of thinking in food system terms. And then the last on this slide, at least, is to try and ensure an appropriate balance in the stimulus materials that were provided. So, for example, how far did we want participants to hear from the meat industry, to hear a point of view that was favourable to the consumption, for example, of red meat and its impact on rural economies, for example, versus the view that there was a consensus around the need for change, supporting a particular view of meat consumption. And here it's interesting that the National Food Strategy has an aim, which is to restore our health and environment. So there's a kind of normative idea on that idea of restoring balance. And there's even, I think, a normative set of implications in terms of apparently innocent words like our or us, for example. Next slide. There was a lot of discussion about how to engage the public without using academic and scientific jargon. So the second phase of the National Food Strategy wanted to talk about what Henry Dimbleby called the social contract, the contract between the public and the food industry and government, for example. And our oversight group urged them not to use that kind of academic construct, but to think more in ordinary language about the roles, responsibilities and expectations of different actors within the food system. Similarly, the oversight group was keen to avoid terms that are somewhat loaded, and particularly false dichotomies like normal and abnormal, or novel and conventional. Often novel foods refer to very specific things like insect-based foods or cultured meat or whatever. But what is novel in one context might not be in another. You know, is corn a novel food, or is it now part of sort of everyday life for a large portion of the population? So perhaps we thought thinking about how foods become normalized might be a better way forward than this kind of distinction that's out there, but not academically very respectable. Similarly, the stretched timetable was an issue, a long gap between the two phases of public engagement, first conducted in April, May, the second not until September, October. And that has led to a squeezing of the time for the National Food Strategy, which means that the kind of big events at the end, the so-called Citizens' Assembly and the National Summit, might now be squeezed out altogether. And then lastly, I think there are a series of challenges here in making sure that this really rich database is mined effectively whilst maintaining the confidentiality of our participants. So I think there's definitely some issues here about how the material is archived and how we make it publicly available for social scientists and others to access. And I think that brings me to my concluding slide. So I see this as a really interesting, almost like a kind of natural experiment in public engagement at the science policy interface. And various forms of public engagement, citizen science, dialogues and so on, are now pretty much of interest across government. And there's a group working within DEFRA through its social science expert group, this project led by Susan Owens, which is doing a sort of review of different forms of engagement at the science policy interface, what methods are appropriate depending on what kind of purpose we might have for doing that engagement. I'm aware that some of the issues I've raised are relevant to any form of public engagement, and that some are more specific to online and digital forms of engagement. And I want to close with a comment about what some people talk of as managing expectations. And this really is talking about what the purpose of engagement is. There's a sort of suspicion that participants' views may or may not be reflected in the final report. And then the recommendations of the final report may or may not be enacted through the white paper that's promised within 6 months of the publication of the second part of the report, and or in spending reviews, which, as we know, have been postponed and then abbreviated in the current crisis. So is the purpose of these exercises to gain legitimacy for a strategy? Is it to secure buy-in from the public? And what difference will it make to public policy? And my very final slide is just to give you my contact details if people want to follow up after the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, and looking forward to seeing as it emerges. It is a shame the Citizens' Assembly may yet fall off the end of the plan, because that was very extremely exciting when that was announced last year. We have got a couple of questions and we have time to take them. The first one, Peter, is where can those that are interested view the information presented by the experts? You mentioned Vox Pops and interviews. Is there any way that people can access what's been seen?
Okay, that was my final slide, and it's about the extent to which things will be archived. My understanding of it, particularly because ScienceWise are involved and are really keen that these kind of public exercises result in an archive that can be used in perpetuity is that they will. But as I said, there are questions about how things become anonymized. Just to refer specifically to those two, there were two separate things. The expert interviews, I think, will be archived. Some of them have already been summarized in little films and so on that were used as stimulus material for phase 1. And then the Vox Pop was slightly different. That was more, as the name suggests, sort of getting the public's views through very short interviews conducted on street corners and so on, to make sure that voices were in the rooms, the 5 different workshops, that might not have been otherwise. So there's, although they were attempting to get a representative sample of the population, I think that was always really hard to do for such as 40 people in 5 places. So at least the Vox Pop there were trying to get voices from those, as I say, might not otherwise have been reflected in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, really important that happens, especially now at this really crucial point in what happens to our food system and what happens to people. I think this, as somebody said earlier on, this year's been a bit of a crunch. So
yeah, and I think that's kind of unfortunate in a way. It's obviously a really important time to collect rich data like this, but it also means that the food system we were thinking about pre-COVID might be very different from the one now reflected in the second phase of the dialogues. So you can see it both ways, can't you? A kind of emergency brings things to a head, demonstrates the fragility of the food system, and is a really good time to analyse things. But that was not how the kind of project was set up by Hopkins Van Mill, had a much kind of cleaner approach to how they were going to do these 2 phases of investigation. And then obviously, like so many other things, it's been disrupted.
Well, yeah, I think it's safe to say planning research was simpler last year than it is this year. But we similarly took the same approach, where we could wait for things to normalise again, or we could go and see the world as it is today and track change. And I think that's going to be really important, and important that stuff is documented. So I don't have any more questions for you. I'm going to leave it open for another minute, and I just fill by saying we had a question previously to your presentation, referring to some of the conversations we had earlier today about how new business models are emerging in disrupting traditional food system chains and food supply chains, and what are we doing to make sure that we control the pop-up businesses and dark kitchens that we've been talking about. And I think particularly referring to Lucy's presentation this morning, which was fascinating. And these are really new business models for food. They're sort of almost applying tech disruption models to food, and we are working with local authorities to support them and get them better at identifying these businesses as they pop up, clues in the name. But also we're working with the big aggregators. So you may not have noticed, but you probably will next time you order a takeaway. You can't order something from Just Eat unless it's got an FHRS rating. In order to have an FHRS rating, it must have been inspected by the local authority. And so we're working closely with the aggregators like Just Eat and Deliveroo to make sure that that becomes a kind of condition of entry to the market. So I hope that answers that question. And I've got one last question for you, Peter, and then I think we'll wrap it up. And thank you so much for your presentation, fascinating, particularly on the, I'm going to say, epistemology.
Yes.
Something like that. The way that you get different information depending on the way you ask and where you ask is fascinating to me. But what was the rationale behind choosing the 5 locations that you did to conduct this research?
Okay, well, I should point out that I didn't choose them. They were chosen by Hopkins Van Mill, the company employed to deliver on the public engagements. However, the role of my committee was to give oversight to that process. The reason for choosing those places was that they were a range of different places with different access to, some were in areas of rural production, farming areas, some less so. Some had a higher proportion of people engaged in fishing, for example, like Grimsby. So it was diversity, essentially. It was an attempt to gain a diversity of places across the UK to avoid a kind of metropolitan London-centric view of the world, and also through not just being those cities, but being their surrounding areas, trying to get rural and urban populations who might have contrasting views. So I think there was no kind of right answer that these were the only places that would do, but I think they were there as a vehicle for recruiting a diversity of people with as close to a representative sample as they could get. And I think there are limitations to that. I think that, for example, in the Grimsby study, there were very few people over 65 or 70. And of course, as we move then to digital engagement, that probably also has implications in terms of the representativeness of the sample. So I don't think claims will be made that this is a nationally representative sample in the way we might do for other kinds of work. But I think the claims to diversity are really important, and that's what they were designed to do.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. So it just remains for me to thank all the speakers today, particularly those from our own teams, but also from our research partners, our international colleagues as well. And particularly thank you, Professor Peter Jackson, for giving us an insight into how that ongoing piece of work is going. More broadly, I'd like to thank the University of Sheffield and behind the scenes, the team who have been working really hard to make this as smooth as it has been. We've been testing the IT capacity that we have to its limits, I think it's safe to say. I hope it's been as interesting for you as it has been for us. And do keep an eye out for these studies. We will be publishing them. And with that, I will hand over, if I may, to Professor Rick Mumford, who is Director of Science in the FSA, to say some final words.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, just to echo that, another excellent event. I mean, this is the third time we've hosted this event, and it's continued to grow and become an increasingly important event for us every year. It's an excellent opportunity for us to showcase the social research that we're involved in and to engage with others from across the social and the food system social science community. For obvious reasons, we had to move it to an online format this year. And while that brings its challenges, it's also an excellent way to reach out to a broader audience, including participants from overseas. As a result, we had over 550 people signed up for this event, which is fantastic. For me, just to very quickly summarise, I think one of the standouts from this year has been highlighting the range of approaches and tools that we now have, so we can access insights from consumers and others and beyond. We heard talks today about the application of new survey methods, social media listening, machine learning, uses of apps and citizen science, all these excellent tools that are now in our toolbox. I think the very final points that sort of picked up, again, themes running through, was this whole piece around data standards, data quality. I think Peter's talk very much highlighted the way that we should think more carefully about how we collect data. We also need to think carefully about, as I said, the quality of the data. I mean, we only have to look to what's happened to polling in the US elections to realise that sometimes you can get it wrong, and you can repeatedly get it wrong if you don't ask the right questions of the right people. I think another challenge, and we've had talks from international speakers today, is that thing about data standards and international comparisons, something that the FSA is often asked to engage with. I think another theme was around how we can use all this data, how we can use this social research and data insight into understanding the complexity of our food system. And I think Lucy's talk from this morning really brought that home, about highlighting the real complexity now of our food system and the online contribution. And then my final point would be, yes, data is critical. Access to quality data is absolutely critical to what we do. But it's the so what, isn't it, with all this stuff? So how do we turn that data into knowledge that makes a difference? So again, we should always have one eye on that when we consider what we're doing. And then finally, just to repeat, to thank you everyone today for their support, to all the speakers, an excellent range of presentations, both in terms of their subject matter and quality. A massive shout out to Becky and Tim and Kabir from the technical team for their excellent work. And finally, yes, just to repeat, big thank you to University of Sheffield, Peter Jackson, for being our partners, and also the Economic and Social Research Council for their support. And this is part of their annual Festival of Science. So thank you very much. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Rick, and that's a wrap. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll probably see you this time next year. I hope you enjoyed it, and look out online because we'll be publishing. See you soon.